Many people have an obsessive hatred of Jacinda Ardern. I do not like Ardern. I think she was a bad Prime Minister. Not as bad as Luxon, but still bad. But the amount of obsessive hate she receives is truly revolting. She receives an exceptional amount of hate when she was not exceptionally bad. She was a relatively standard Prime Minister. Yes, Jacinda Ardern violated the Bill of Rights Act. Every Prime Minister violated the Bill of Rights Act. Helen Clark, John Key, Christopher Luxon, all of them have violated the Bill of Rights Act. This is nothing new.
Okay, let's be real. What part of the Bill of Rights Act has Christopher Luxon breached that anyone has noticed? Because there's a difference between violating the Bill of Rights Act technically, and then there's literally and unashamedly breaching the Bill of Rights Act, and frankly, I would argue the Human Rights Act, and doing so whilst gaslighting everyone into thinking you didn't, whilst convincing at least half the country that you are some saint, that it was for their own good, telling them that if we did not do this, you would be dead. Emotional manipulation. Like, let's be real, I can't think of a single policy outside of gang patches that has genuinely had anything which you could argue breach the Bill of Rights Act. I'm going to say it. I don't care. I don't think it's your right to have a gang patch. And you could argue that it breaches freedom of expression somewhat, or the right to congregate when you've got some of those gang affiliation thingamabobs kind of being restricted, and the assembly with your gang patches and so forth. But I'm like, that's public safety. That's about protecting other people's rights that they aren't, giving up by being, disgusting gang members who go out of their way to make everyone's lives miserable on purpose. It's the same reason why we don't complain about a breach of the Bill of Rights Act and whatnot when someone gets put in prison. They're there for a reason. It's considered a justified breach of these rights, because you're breaking the civil contract. Again, nothing holds a candle to Jacinda Ardern. Nothing in our history. I will take dawn raids every single day for year on year on year on year on year before I take Jacinda Ardern. And that's because I don't actually, in principle, have an issue with dawn raids, because if you don't belong in this country, you shouldn't be here anyway. So take with that what you will. But he's just missing the fundamental point. You cannot pretend that Jacinda Ardern and Jacinda Ardern's breaching of the Bill of Rights Act is comparable to anything that previous Prime Ministers has done. It's not even close.
And all of them would have done what Ardern did had they governed during COVID.
See, there's a chance they would have. I don't believe... See, here's the thing. I don't think they would have done mandates. That's the biggest thing. Do I think they would have locked down? Probably. Do I think they would have closed the borders? Absolutely. Do I think they would have gone to the lengths of mandates? I do not actually know. Because a lot of countries didn't. Even countries that were reasonably hard on a lot of the areas which we did. They didn't necessarily crack down and make a full two-tier society like Ardern did. They didn't sit down with the New Zealand Herald and say, yeah, that's what we did. That's exactly what we did. We made two classes of citizens based on vaccination status. They didn't do that. Ardern did. She admitted it outright. So we can deal with whataboutisms all we like. We can deal with hypotheticals. What would have Simon Bridges done? I think Simon Bridges has a far more balanced approach to things like this than she ever did. At the end of the day, all Labour did versus what Simon Bridges proposed in the early days was everything he would have done, but way later than it should have been done, meaning that we were behind the eight ball off the bat, forcing us to do things like lockdowns, forcing us to deal with their ridiculous wage subsidy thing, because they did not listen to National at the time, who, frankly, I will give them kudos, were actually being reasonable and realistic with their recommendations. Restricting access to the country was fine, in my opinion. Allow New Zealanders back, Everyone else can piss off for a few months until we suss out exactly where things stand. That was fine. Plus, it was March. Tourist season's kind of over for a couple months until you get to the ski slopes. I think things would have been very different. There would have been elements that were the same. I wouldn't rule out lockdowns in it at all. But I think Simon Bridges, who only really lost his position in that top spot because of a little bit of politicking from the more liberal members of the party and the overall kind of demonization of National by the media and Labour, who were getting all of the airtime, that is kind of the downfall of Simon Bridges there. And I think Simon Bridges in that period was significantly better than, let's say, Judith Collins. And so I'm trying to base how I would view National's actions with Simon Bridges versus Judith Collins, because I think Judith Collins would have been a lot closer to Jacinda Ardern than Simon Bridges during this time.
Ardern was anything but exceptional. She was not even very left-wing. She wouldn't even endorse legalizing cannabis, for God's sake.
Called being politically correct because you're already lacking that. You're already trying to portray yourself as some saint. So you're not about to come out and say, oh yeah, I agree with all these inherently anti-saint-like behaviors that the left typically endorses. So she was very much a leftist, there's no doubt about it. She was very much a socialist, there's no doubt about it. But in order to maintain the facade and manipulate enough people, she needed to seem like a moderate. And she did a pretty good job, if even you think that she was.
She was just another centrist career politician. She was not exceptionally good or exceptionally evil. 90% of the hate she gets is motivated by mindless misogynistic bigotry. Notice
you replace Ardern's body with Simon Bridges, the exact same opinions. Opinions are completely unchanged. And that's how you know there's no misogyny there, because absolutely every single person who was in a position of power during that time, which pushed the same nonsense, receives similar levels of, hate and so forth. The difference was they weren't Prime Minister. And so because she was Prime Minister, the buck stops with her and she gets the most heat. That is the only reason she gets more heat than Chris Hipkins, because she was Prime Minister. Chris Hipkins still gets a lot of it. Let's not get it twisted. Chris Hipkins still gets a lot of it. National still gets a lot of it, even though they weren't the ones making the decisions. They were simply there in opposition. ACT and National still get a lot of heat for this entire period because of what they did during the Parliament protest. You have no idea what you're talking about, frankly, Paul, and the whole misogyny card is so lefty of you.
That Hipkins does not get 1% of the criticism that Jacinda Ardern gets.
He probably gets about 33% or something like that, but the reality is he was the minister of everything during the time. He gets a lot of heat for that, but he was not Prime Minister during those key decisions. He wasn't Prime Minister until 2023. No one wanted him then. He was just an irrelevant, sausage roll-eating ginger.
Even though Hipkins was a major figure in her government and supported all of her decisions. It is the most clear-cut case of disgusting evil misogyny that I have ever seen. These hateful, obsessed freaks love ranting about Ardern. They should not be so comfortable doing this. They should be mocked and ridiculed for being pathetic, misogynistic losers.
I always love the intensity that Paul brings. He always makes out like the people he's talking about are really these truly horrible evil. He just really relies on the hyperbole to get his point across, which I like. I like hyperbole. But I like hyperbole when it's an accurate reflection, but just, upped up a little bit. This is not remotely justified. This hyperbole is not justified in any way whatsoever. So that's where he loses it. When I rely on hyperbole, which is far less than I wish I did, it's unfortunately most of the shit I say which is out there is true. Unfortunately, when I rely on it, it is because it's justified. But I called Jacinda Ardern evil because her actions were objectively evil. He wants you to believe that those who hate on Ardern to this day are more evil than she was. That their entire hate-filled tirades that they go on about her are just blatant evil misogyny. That their actual view of Ardern is a fiction, is a figment of their imagination, filled with hatred, misogyny, and they're rooted in evil intentions. Or maybe, just hear me out, maybe They were mandated out of their jobs. They had their families torn apart. They had their health dramatically impacted to the point where they will never be the same again. Just in general, they're very much aware that Ardern increased our net debt, or net core crown debt relative to GDP by about 1,800%. For those of you who don't know, that's about 18 times. And, well, we're just not happy about it. Would you be happy about it? I know I'm not. So, yeah. COVID was her opportunity to take what she actually believes and implement it by stealth whilst telling you she's doing it because you will die if she doesn't. That's the reality. She spent 2017 to 2020 prepping. Then she spent 2020 to 2022 implementing. That is how she got us. That is why our debt is out of control. That is why we needed to revise how we viewed debt figures in 2022 so that it made it look like, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, no, we're not in that much debt. We're not really in that much debt. The reason why they were so eager to change it is because having a debt to GDP ratio of around 45% does not look good. It does not look good going into an election. 20% is far more palatable. 18% more so. That's why they did it. They wanted to switch it up and say, all of this debt over here, no, that's not debt. That's not debt, folks. Albeit you could argue it's more consistent with other countries all you like. If we change how it looks so that we've got this basis that we've used for a very long time, this definition that we've used for a very long time, that people understand, that people have come used to, and then suddenly, oh yeah, no, our debt to GDP is only like 18, 19%. Elect us. We're doing a fantastic job despite the fact we've literally sold your futures. For nothing, by the way. That's the worst part. Then people are more likely to elect you. The people still believe that Labour weren't that bad on the economy because of this change. Even though half of the articles will still use the old definition when they reference our debt to GDP because it makes National look bad. Because yes, National is increasing our debt to this day. Not nearly by as much, by the way, but enough where it is frustrating and it's bad for us and they really shouldn't be doing it. They should instead be not being Labour light, more or less. Because they are being Labour light. Everyone who is finally woken up to National and the Uni Party is aware of that.
They should not be such a loud voice. I am opposed to mindless worship of Ardern. I think she was a bad Prime Minister. But she was not the tyrant that these mindless victim mindset-plagued idiots pretend she was. If she was a tyrant, the Parliament protesters would have been massacred, or the organisers would have been disappeared before anyone heard a thing about it. People have no conception of just how lucky they are. The victim mindset some people have is truly amazing. If Ardern is a tyrant, we must have it pretty good. Of course, all the Ardern haters worship Donald Trump, an actual aspiring tyrant who is deporting people for protesting, stomping on the Constitution, and openly tried to overturn the 2020 election result.
Honestly, Donald Trump derangement syndrome is something else. Crikey me. I thought the media was bad. Deporting illegal immigrants, not protesters. Illegal immigrants who happen to be protesting their status as illegal immigrants. Illegal immigrants got deported. And he also did a bunch of things that he said he would do because he has the authority to do them. Oh, wow. Oh, tyrant in training. He also deployed the National Guard, again, something he has the power to do, to actually rid cities like DC and Chicago of crime, or at least crack down on it where Democrat politicians refuse to. Because that would be, oh, it's not very good to their culture if we actually hold them accountable for their actions. Woke shit. Trump's doing what he said he would do. Trump's using his power to the fullest of extent, as he should, as anyone should, if it's needed to be used. That's all he's doing. Trump is no tyrant. Trump isn't even trying to be a tyrant. And as far as 2021's inauguration, or the not inauguration, but the January 6th thing goes, move on. I mean, even people on the right are pretty unsure really what happened there. I go with there was a lot of bad actors who were paid for, who helped incite the illegal actions, but 99% of the people there did nothing wrong. As far as the video footage is concerned, they kind of just walked through the doors. How are they to know what happened ahead of them? I wouldn't. And so, yeah, that's that. And Jacinda Ardern, oh no, she didn't use the tanks on us. She didn't fire weapons at us, not the lethal kind, so she's not a tyrant. We had it lucky. In fact, we had it lucky that all she did was have Trevor Mallard turn the sprinklers onto protests. Have it lucky that she only employed the police to abuse, assault, and gouge the eyes out of protesters, among other things. To use various other forms of things that they refused to acknowledge that they used. We had it lucky that she only did that to try and literally prevent protesters from protesting. She genuinely tried by force to remove protesters and in the end kind of succeeded. Why? Because there were a couple bad faith actors in attendance there who gave the police just that little bit of justification that many of the average mindless voters believe to this day. Oh, no, see, they burned that tent, which ended up burning down that ridiculously overpriced playground which no one wants or uses. They did all that, and so that justifies gouging the eyes out of protesters, forcefully removing them, even though that was 3 weeks in. Oh no, the fact that protester was being verbally abusive to a parliamentarian means that protest can't go ahead. That protest must be stopped by all means necessary. In fact, we must antagonize those protesters as the police force because Jacinda Ardern doesn't want it to happen. She wanted that, and she utilized her powers sparingly to ensure that protest was given all of the worst possible coverage and delegitimized from day one. And that's exactly what she did in the eyes of the majority. And so she succeeded to do exactly what using tanks wouldn't have done within the Western New Zealand context. Because that's the difference here. You cannot compare the tyranny of a China, tyranny of a Soviet Russia, tyranny of a North Korea to the tyranny of a modern Western civilization that is supposedly a democracy. There are different shades of tyranny. We happen to have the Western democracy type. Jacinda Ardern is an establishment globalist hack who has done absolutely nothing for this country in her life. She likes to pretend and convince some of you, let's say less endowed intellectually individuals that she has, but the reality is she's never done anything for us. She's lied to us, she's used us, she's abused us, and she's moved on to greater things. Ardern's under no illusion about what Labour is, just as what National is. They are two major parties which you're allowed to vote for, but really they're both voting for globalism, they're both voting for more of the same, both voting for failure, and both voting for your slow but inevitable subjugation. That's all it is. That is what Ardern proved, that the majority of us are simply incapable of being discerning in times of crisis. And so the more crises that come upon us, the easier it is to control us, and that much is clear. So hopefully some of us have learned our lesson from 2020. I certainly learned many lessons. And, we won't get to a point where the tyranny of the non-Western nations becomes the norm, or even a necessity to take back the country.
Going so far as to pardon cop-bashing rioters. These worthless losers wouldn't know authoritarianism if they tripped over it. Jacinda Ardern was just another mediocre centrist prime minister. She was not an evil tyrant, and she was not a progressive icon either.
She was not an evil tyrant, Your Honour. She was not a progressive icon, Your Honour, and therefore I absolve her. I simply cannot agree, and I must defend this point, that she was not a tyrant. Because she was in a Western democracy. She was centrist according to me and me alone. She was not much of a progressive at all, despite being one of the most progressive prime ministers in terms of policy that we've had in some time. Let's get it clear. Full-term abortion is one of the most progressive policies I've ever seen in my life. I'm only 25, but full-term abortion's pretty radical. But it doesn't really matter if Ardern was a progressive. It really doesn't. It doesn't matter if she did pass the, full-term abortion law or whatever. What does matter is what progressiveness actually is and what it stands for on the left. Progressive is just a code name for Marxism, or it's just a code name for left-wing political thought. If you're not a progressive, then you're regressive. More importantly, if you're not a progressive, you're an oppressor. And if you're an oppressor, then you need to be fought against, and the revolution needs to be against you in particular. Progressiveness is just what level of revolutionary are you? How close are you to being deployable as a member of the rebellion, as a member of the revolution to overthrow? The more progressive you are, the more malleable you are, the more likely you are weak of mind, the more likely you are to be controlled, and the more likely you are to die for the cause. So the less progressive you are, generally speaking, the better you are at thinking for yourself, and the less likely you are to engage in violence for political reasons. So Tyrant or not, much of what Paul said in this one was unfounded. I mean, just pretending like Ardern did not blatantly create two classes of citizen, lock down an entire country, close our borders far longer than they probably should have been, and for the most part, do nothing that wasn't in her own interests when it came to the COVID response. I think that says a lot. She literally blamed that KFC worker for her own F-up. Remember that? Blame the KFC worker because, we'll believe that a KFC worker, who was a minority by the way, was to blame for a new outbreak, not your shitty MIQ systems, which you were already told weren't fit for purpose. It's your fault. It always was your fault, Ardern. And no amount of gaslighting from Paul here, saying that all of the people that hate on Ardern are just evil misogynists, will change that Ardern locked an entire country down, she sold our futures to globalists, and achieved absolutely nothing of value for our country. And need I mention the number of people who were visited by police during her reign and afterwards as a unfortunate carry-on because of what we said? Because of what we said about things like COVID, about her response, about her politics in general, about kind of anything that was remotely critical of the left? Need I mention that? And so, Tyrant or not, I'm going to wear on the side of Tyrant, because she did lock down an entire country. She did blame the KFC worker, of all things, for her own stuff-up. She did deploy the police force against protesters. She did engage in politicking in a manner which we probably haven't really seen before. She did engage in an abuse of her power to try and benefit herself and her own policy agenda at the expense of New Zealanders. And then she did run away like a good tyrant does. She was the tyrant in chief, and most people rolled over and took it without a word.